A final ride. The woman who laughed before the push. Daniel staggered back, his pulse racing. That wasn't there before. It couldn't have been there before. A scraping sound echoed from the tunnel. It was faint at first, like nails dragging along concrete. But it grew louder, more jagged, until it was an unbearable screech, metal grinding against stone. Then, from the tunnel's depths, something stepped onto the tracks. A shape emerged from the darkness, slow and deliberate, like it had been waiting. A woman, her body draped in shadows, her long, tangled hair obscuring her face. Her limbs moved unnaturally, her joints bending too loosely, her steps soundless despite the crunch of gravel beneath her feet. Daniel couldn't move. His body was frozen, his instincts screaming at him to run, to escape. But where? The woman stepped closer, tilting her head, her tangled hair shifting just enough to reveal a sliver of her face. Her mouth stretched into a grin. Daniel stumbled backward, his heart pounding so violently it threatened to tear from his chest. The woman's lips parted. And she laughed. The sound clawed its way into his ears, a gurgling, breathless giggle that belonged to something that should not exist. Daniel turned and ran. He sprinted along the platform, his legs screaming in protest, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. His mind had no plan. Just away, away, away. But the station had no exit. No way out. He was trapped. Then, a sudden gust of air. The unmistakable sound of an approaching train. Daniel's eyes widened. That wasn't possible. There were no other trains. There hadn't been another train for. The lights above flickered violently. The walls groaned, as if the entire station were shifting, changing. A blinding set of headlights tore through the tunnel's darkness. A train, ancient and rust-covered, its windows blackened, its wheels shrieking against the rails, thundered into the station. The woman on the tracks stood motionless. She did not run. She did not move. And just before the train reached her, she vanished. The train screeched to a halt. The doors slid open. Daniel stood at the edge of the platform, panting, staring at the open doors. Inside, the car was dimly lit, the seats covered in old peeling fabric. The overhead bars were rusted, the windows clouded with dust. A station announcement crackled over unseen speakers. The voice was distorted, garbled, like a recording played over and over until the words lost all meaning. But Daniel understood one thing. This train was waiting for him. He swallowed hard, his entire body trembling. He knew what he should do. Stay. Don't get on. Wait. But the platform was empty, the exit non-existent. And the woman. Where had she gone? His pulse thundered in his ears. His breath felt ragged. He couldn't stay here. Slowly, hesitantly, he stepped forward. One step. Then another. And then, just as he crossed the threshold of the train's doors, he heard it. A whisper. So close it was almost inside his head. A single word. Push. The doors slammed shut behind him. The train roared to life, pulling away from Eldamere Station, vanishing once more into the endless black tunnel. The train car shuddered as it lurched forward, swallowing Daniel into its dimly lit belly. The flickering overhead lights cast long, jagged shadows across the seats, stretching and twisting like grasping fingers. His breath came in short gasps, his pulse still hammering in his skull. He didn't dare look back at the closed doors. The air inside the train was thick with dust and something else, something old, like stale breath left behind by passengers long forgotten. The windows were dark, refusing to reveal what lay beyond the glass. Daniel turned, scanning the interior. He wasn't alone. Figures sat in the rows ahead, unmoving. A man in a worn-out business suit, his head bowed low, his fingers clenched tight around a briefcase. A woman in a faded floral dress, staring blankly forward. A child. Daniel froze. The child was looking right at him. A little girl, no older than 6, her skin pale, her dark eyes too wide, too hollow. She sat 3 rows ahead, her tiny legs swinging just above the floor, Her hands folded neatly in her lap. She opened her mouth. No sound came out, but her lips moved, forming a single word. Run. Daniel's stomach twisted. His legs felt rooted in place. He didn't move, couldn't move. The train rocked gently as it gained speed, the rhythmic clatter of wheels on the tracks the only sound in the suffocating silence. Then, the overhead lights flickered. For a fraction of a second, Daniel saw it. A reflection in the darkened window beside him. The woman. She was standing right behind him. His breath caught in his throat. The lights flickered again, longer this time, and he felt it, a hand grazing his shoulder. Daniel spun around, his heart slamming against his ribs. Nothing. Just empty seats. Just shadows. But when he turned back toward the little girl, she was gone. The seats where she had sat were vacant, the fabric torn, frayed as if they had been abandoned for decades. A chill ran down his spine. He backed away, gripping a metal pole for balance, his mind screaming at him to wake up, wake up, wake up. The train screeched violently. Daniel stumbled forward, barely catching himself. The lights above flickered erratically, their buzzing growing louder, more distorted, almost like laughter. The train wasn't stopping. There were no announcements, no stations passing by. Just endless dark beyond the windows. Then the voice returned. Soft, melodic, too close. You saw, didn't you? Daniel's entire body tensed. The voice was everywhere, in the air around him, in the vibration of the train, inside his own head. He knew that voice. The woman. His breath quickened. He gripped the pole tighter. Who are you? He whispered, his voice barely audible over the rattling of the train. A pause. Then, the voice again, a whisper laced with amusement. You already know. The lights went out completely. Darkness swallowed the train. Daniel's breathing hitched. He couldn't see, couldn't move. The train's motion continued, the vibration pulsing beneath his feet. Then, a presence. Something was there with him. Soft footsteps. Coming closer. Slow. Deliberate. The breath of something unseen ghosted over his neck, sending ice through his veins. A giggle, just behind his ear. The lights flickered back on. Daniel whirled around. She was sitting in the seat across from him. Her grin was stretched wide, too wide. Her dark hair hung in damp, tangled strands over her pale face, her eyes hollow pools of endless black. Her fingers tapped against the seat beside her in a slow rhythmic pattern, mimicking the train's steady hum. Tap, tap, tap. Daniel's throat was dry. His mind screamed for him to run, but where? There was nowhere to go. The doors were sealed. The windows were black voids. The other passengers. He turned his head slightly. The other passengers were gone. The train was empty now. Just him. Just her. And she was still staring. Still grinning. Daniel forced himself to speak. What do you want? Her head tilted. Her fingers stopped tapping. The train gave a sudden, violent lurch. Daniel was thrown sideways, barely catching himself against a seat. The lights flickered again, casting everything in fractured shadows. The woman stood up. She took a step forward. Then another. Daniel scrambled backward, heart hammering. Stay away, he gasped. She only laughed. That horrible wet giggle that echoed from everywhere at once. And then, the train slammed to a stop. The force of it sent Daniel crashing into the metal pole, his vision flashing white with pain. The doors hissed open, revealing a platform beyond. He barely registered the name on the wall before his stomach dropped. Eldermere. The same station. He never left. Daniel staggered to his feet, his vision swimming. The woman was still standing in the aisle, her grin unfaltering. And then she raised her hand. She waved. The train doors began to close. Daniel's instincts took over. He lunged forward, throwing himself through the doors just before they sealed shut. He collapsed onto the cold platform, gasping for breath. His body ached, his skin slick with sweat. The train remained still for a moment. Through the windows, he could barely make out her shape, standing motionless in the dim interior. Then, just as the train began to pull away, she moved. She pressed her hand against the glass. And for the first time, her grin faded. She mouthed something. Daniel couldn't hear it. But he understood. Next time. The train disappeared into the tunnel, swallowed by the dark. The platform was empty again, silent as death. But Daniel knew. This wasn't over. The silence of Eldamere Station felt heavier now, like the air had thickened around Daniel. The train was gone, swallowed by the darkness of the tunnel, and yet its presence still lingered, a phantom of its passage whispering through the stagnant air. The last thing he saw before the doors shut was her, that thing, pressing her pale hand to the glass. Her lips had formed words he could not hear, but the message was clear: next time. Daniel sat up on the cold platform, his breath ragged. His limbs ached, his head throbbed. He wasn't sure how long he lay there, paralyzed by fear, before the sound of rustling paper drew his attention. He turned his head sharply. A newspaper fluttered across the empty platform, caught in an unseen draft. The fluorescent station lights buzzed overhead, casting a sickly yellow hue on the tiled floor. Eldamere Station still looked abandoned, frozen in time like a forgotten relic. And yet, he wasn't alone. A figure stood near the edge of the platform, its back to him. A man, tall and thin, dressed in an old-fashioned trench coat. His shoulders were stiff, his hands buried deep in his pockets. He hadn't been there when Daniel fell. He was just there. Daniel swallowed hard, forcing himself to his feet. "Excuse me," his voice cracked. He cleared his throat, tried again. "Sir." The man didn't move. He stood eerily still, like a wax figure. Daniel took a step forward. I need help. I think something." The man's head jerked slightly, and Daniel froze. Slowly, painfully slowly, the man turned his head over his shoulder. His face was obscured by the shadow of his hat, but Daniel could feel his stare, heavy and piercing. Not right. There was something wrong about him. Then the man spoke, his voice dry, brittle, like dead leaves crushed underfoot. "She let you go." Daniel's blood ran cold. The man turned fully now, his face partially illuminated by the buzzing station lights. His skin was waxy, his eyes sunken into dark hollows. He looked like a corpse that had forgotten to decay. Daniel took an involuntary step back. Who are you?" The man ignored the question. His lips barely moved when he spoke. "She let you go, but that doesn't mean you've escaped." The words settled like ice in Daniel's veins. He shook his head. "I don't understand." The man took a step forward, and the sound echoed unnaturally through the empty station. "No one leaves, not really. You're still on the ride, even if you think you've stepped off." Daniel's breathing grew shallow. "What does that mean?" The man didn't answer. Instead, he turned his gaze toward the train tracks. Daniel followed his line of sight. At first, there was nothing, just the yawning black tunnel stretching into the unknown. Then the distant rumble began. The rails shuddered. A cold wind slithered through the station, sending that same newspaper skittering across the floor. Daniel's stomach twisted into knots. It was coming back. A deep, distorted laughter slithered through the air. It wasn't coming from the tunnel. It was everywhere. Daniel turned sharply, but the man in the trench coat was gone. His breath caught in his throat. He was alone again. The rumbling grew louder. A pair of headlights pierced through the tunnel's darkness, twin eyes burning in the abyss. Daniel staggered backward, his pulse hammering. The train pulled into the station, slowing as it approached the platform. The windows were black voids, reflections warped and twisted like stretched skin. The doors hissed open. Daniel took another step back. He wouldn't get on. He wouldn't. And then, from the depths of the train car, The darkness shifted. A hand gripped the metal pole near the doorway, fingers too long, skin too pale. Then, she stepped out. The woman's grin was smaller now, but somehow worse. Like she was toying with him, savoring this moment. Her black eyes gleamed under the flickering lights, her damp hair clinging to her hollow cheeks. She tilted her head. "I told you," she whispered. "Next time." Daniel's legs trembled. He would not go back. He turned, ready to run. But his body wouldn't move. A cold, invisible force clamped down on him, paralyzing him in place. His breath hitched. He struggled, but it was useless. The woman took a step forward. And another. She reached for him. Daniel opened his mouth to scream. And then the world shifted. The station, the train, the woman. Everything flickered. Like a television cutting to static. And suddenly, Daniel was seated. His hands clutched the armrests of a subway seat, his breath ragged, his body drenched in sweat. The train rocked gently beneath him, moving through the tunnels. Passengers surrounded him. Normal people. A woman scrolling through her phone. A man nodding off in the corner. The artificial voice of the intercom announced the next stop. Daniel's heart pounded. He looked at his hands, his legs. He was back. His eyes darted to the window. His reflection stared back at him, pale and shaken, but alone. No one else. The train slowed as it neared a station. The doors slid open. A few passengers stepped out. Daniel hesitated. He didn't know what was real anymore. But he wasn't staying. He rose from his seat, stepping onto the platform. The cool air of the subway station hit his face. He turned, watching as the train doors shut, the machine groaning as it pulled away. Through the window, in the last second before the train vanished into the dark, he saw her. Sitting in the seat he had just left. Still smiling. The train disappeared. Daniel took a slow, shaking breath. The station was full of people. The world felt normal again. But he knew, deep down, the truth. The ride was never over. Somewhere, sometime, she would come back for him.